welcome back to Food Prep Guide. Today we are going to be making and canning onion broth. This is a recipe that many of you ask about, and I have a video on preserving onions 5 different ways, and this onion broth recipe is kind of buried inside of that video, so I thought it's about time to do a dedicated video on how to make and can onion broth. Now I will note, if you are to go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation's website and type in onion broth, you will not find a tested, proven, safe recipe for onion broth. You will find plenty of recipes for just broth, but specifically onion broth, you're not going to find that. Does that mean it's not safe to can? Absolutely not. But I do want to let y'all know, anytime that I deviate even the slightest from the National Center for Food Home Preservation canning guidelines, I want y'all to know that up front, because if you're a brand new canner, I do recommend sticking to those. If you are a more experienced canner, you know that certain things are safe even if there's not a published recipe for it, and this is one of those. So if you're interested, keep on watching. We'll make and can some onion broth.
By the way, if you would like help building your food storage, scroll down to the description box of this video and click this link for our free 1-year food storage plan. We calculated a year's supply of food for one person, then broke that data down into a week-by-week list of items to build your pantry on a budget. We'll send it straight to your inbox. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss all of our upcoming food preservation, pantry storage, and gardening tutorials. Now back to the kitchen. The version that I am making today is actually an onion scrap broth, and what I will do throughout the gardening season, preservation season, and even just regular cooking throughout the year is I will save my onion skins. I will also save my onion tops, and I will put them in the freezer just in gallon-sized bags like this, and so that's why they look a little bit wet. You might see some ice crystals because they've been sitting in my freezer for a while. And I just wait until I have enough to pretty much fill up this roaster and do a batch of broth. Like I mentioned, that I keep my green onion tops as well. When I am making and harvesting onions in the garden season, I will use the green onion tops and dehydrate them to make an onion powder. But I try to always set aside some to add some extra flavor and bulk to my onion broth for throughout the season, because we use a ton of this onion broth. We make chicken broth, beef broth, vegetable stock, but this onion broth, or an onion scrap broth, is our absolute favorite. The flavor is just amazing. Anytime that I am making onion scrap broth like this, I do like to add at least 2 onions just to make sure that I'm really getting a very, very strong onion flavor. The only thing that I would mention as far as the peels go is just to make sure the onions are very clean. Since this is an onion scrap, we are using those outer layers of the onions, which of course can gather dirt and debris and dust, especially if you're going to be using your homegrown onions. Just give those a good scrub as if you were going to be canning them, which we are going to be canning these, but anytime that you're canning food, you scrub it really good. We even do a peroxide rinse a lot of times on our produce, and just treat this onion scrap broth, treat the onions that go into it as if you were canning the onions themselves. I will use pretty much the entire peel except the root end. This is what it looks like. That contains just too much dirt, and it's very hard to get that completely clean. The soil is where the botulism bacteria lives. And so that's why it's so important to clean our food so thoroughly. And so because the dirt can get trapped easily in that root ball, I don't use the root ends. As far as seasonings go, I just use salt, pepper, and turmeric powder. The pepper helps the turmeric powder to be absorbed better by the body. And of course, it also just adds some flavorings. You saw how I sprinkled in the salt. I don't measure any of these things except for the turmeric. I just sprinkle in some salt. I do a pinch of pepper, and then I do a tablespoon to a heaping tablespoon of the turmeric powder. Not only does it provide the health benefits, but it provides a very deep, orangey golden color to your onion broth that it looks beautiful on the shelf. It looks great when you're cooking into your food, and you're getting the benefits of the turmeric as well. And that is it. And then it's just a matter of topping off with water. The amount of water is going to depend on what container that you're using. I'm using this countertop roaster oven, and I put in approximately 1.5 gallons of water. I'm essentially just going to about 1 inch below the top, as you can see here. And then I just mix it all good together and let it cook overnight. I mentioned that I don't measure the water. You just need to kind of judge how strong you want your onion broth to be. Um, that's just, less water is going to make it more concentrated flavor. More water is you're going to get a higher volume, but it's going to be slightly more diluted in flavor. So just keep that in mind. Whenever I'm cooking overnight, I cook at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. I started this about 8 p.m. the night before, and here it is around 9 a.m. the next morning. And this is what it looks like. And we are ready to simply separate the solids from the liquids. I like to use my extra large strainer spoon here. This comes in handy for all sorts of things in food preservation. I will link it in the description box below. I've done this different ways over the years. I used to be super impatient, and I would try to lift up that entire roaster oven and pour it into this massive strainer basket. I don't do that anymore because it's just a mess waiting to happen, and so I do the slow and steady way with this strainer spoon from now on. But once you separate the solids, you're left with a beautiful onion broth that is ready to be canned up, and let's walk through that canning process.
We are ready to get canning, so I've got my pressure canner set up. All broths are low acid, therefore they must be pressure canned in order to be canned safely. So to get this prepped, I just have about 3 inches of water in the bottom of my canner, and the, what's that called? Canning rack. The canning rack, because the glass jars don't need to come into direct contact with this canner. And then because the broth is pretty warm that I'm putting into it, I'm going to go ahead and get it heating up on low to get that water nice and warm to avoid thermal shock when we put our pretty hot jars inside this water. Okay, at this point I have turned my roaster oven off, and now it's just a matter of filling up our jars. Now when you are canning something like a chicken broth, basically an animal-based broth, the canning guidelines state that we need to put them in the refrigerator, like fill up some jars, put them in the refrigerator, wait for any of the fats to solidify, and then skim them off the top, and then bring all that broth back to a boil, and then start with what we're doing right now. Because this has no animal fats in it, we can skip that stage. There aren't any solids that we have to take out. There aren't any greasy, fatty foods that are going to prevent us from getting a good seal. So we can skip that and go straight to filling up our jars. I'm going to be filling my jars to about 1-inch headspace. Another thing with canning, of course, is we always debubble. But when it's something that is straight liquid like this, the way that I debubble is I simply shake the jar back and forth like this. And I mean, there's no bubbles in that. It works out any bubbles. So I won't be debubbling. I'm just going to be filling up. I'm using a pint jar just to give me some more volume per scoop. Otherwise, it would take very long if I just use my regular scoop. Other than that, I don't think there's really any other tips or advice I can think of. This needs to can for 25 minutes in quarts. Like I mentioned, this has to be pressure canned. After I get all of these jars filled up, I will be wiping my rims, putting on new clean lids, new clean rings to fingertip tight, and into the canner they go. case anyone has an All-American canner like this, or one that just screws down like this, you want to tighten the screws on the opposite sides at the same time. You don't want to go one by one. This just ensures that you have a nice even seal all the way around. And just like when you are like screwing something in, you don't want to tighten it down all the way just yet. Do it just a little bit until all of them are tightened all the way around. And now I can go back through and really tighten them down, still using the opposite knobs at a time. Okay. The next step is to start bringing this up to temperature. So I'm going to turn it up to high, and we're going to wait until there is a steady stream of steam coming out of this vent pipe right here. We're going to let that vent for 10 minutes straight. So I'm not going to set my 10-minute timer until this thing is going psh, until it is spurting out constantly, and then I will set a timer for 10 minutes and let it continue to do that for 10 minutes before we put our weight on. We now have a steady stream of steam coming out of our vent pipe, so I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes. I'm going to let it vent for 10 minutes before we add our weight. Our timer has gone off. So it's time to put our gauge on, our weighted gauge. I am below 1,000 feet elevation, so I need 10 pounds of pressure. Be sure to reference a chart, an elevation chart, to see how many pounds of pressure you need to can at based on your elevation. So I'm just going to protect my hand with a towel. Slip that on. At this point, we are going to let this come up to pressure. And we can tell this two ways. So I have a dial gauge here and a weighted gauge here. The more accurate way to gauge pressure is with a weighted gauge. But if all you have is a dial gauge, that's totally fine. Just make sure it's calibrated. We need to pressure can this at approximately 10 pounds of pressure for my elevation. But again, be sure to reference a chart for your elevation. The other way that we can know when it's right, you see that jiggle? Can you hear that jiggle? I'm going to wait for it to stop. So do you see and hear how it's not stopping? So my pressure is a little bit too high, and this is verified by this dial gauge right here. So I'm going to lower the heat on my canner. And you'll see that weighted gauge stop moving in just a minute. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit more. At this point, all we're doing is adjusting the heat on our stovetop until our weighted gauge does this jiggling motion a few times per minute. Right now, it's jiggling constantly, as you can see on camera, which means my heat is too high. But I did just turn it down, and I'm just kind of waiting for it to kind of even out before I make any more adjustments. Okay, my weight is right at the proper amount of jiggle, which I'll explain in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and start my time for 25 minutes. I can verify that I'm at the correct pounds of pressure. Over here with my dial gauge, it's 10 pounds of pressure. This weighted gauge over here, it needs to jiggle and dance like that several times a minute, but it should stop in between. Here it stopped. It should stay stopped for 10 to 15 seconds, start again and go for another 10, 15, 20 seconds. Then it should stop again for 15, 20 seconds, and so on, just to where it's essentially jiggling and dancing several times a minute, which is exactly where we're at. So this is where we can keep the heat. This is where we are good to go to can for 25 minutes. Our timer just went off, so now all we're going to do is turn the heat off. We're not going to take the weight off, we're not going to touch the canner, we're not going to move it. We'll just wait until it completely comes down to pressure. And this gauge reads 0, and then I'll wait just a few minutes longer, and then we will remove the weight, take the lid off, and show you what the broth looks like. Our onion broth is done processing. I let it come down to pressure, and then I let it sit to cool off for probably 10 to 15 minutes after it had come down pressure. And here's what it looks like. That turmeric really adds a beautiful golden type color. I'll put these out on the counter and probably clean them off and put them up tomorrow. Hope this was helpful to y'all, and we will see you next time. Bye.